Marcos Turner woke up to the sound of trees swaying outside, a noise that usually wasn't unusual in Millfield, Oklahoma. His clock read 7:30 a.m., and a gray light filtered through the faded curtains in the living room. He had spent the last few months trying to fix the fence at the back of his property, but his motivation came and went like the dust in the wind of the countryside. Today was supposed to be just another day, he thought. He got up, pulled on a worn-out t-shirt, and headed for the kitchen. The kettle hissed on the stove as he absent-mindedly stared out the window. The sky, usually calm and peaceful in its pale hues, seemed heavy, too heavy for an ordinary morning. Probably a storm, he muttered, stirring his black coffee. Marcos didn't have much company other than Max, the dog he adopted 2 years ago, and the old radio that sat on the kitchen counter. He turned on the radio and tuned it to the local station, hoping to hear the weather report as he chewed on a piece of stale bread. The announcer's voice was calm yet firm. Urgent bulletin. A storm system is moving rapidly toward the Millfield area. Tornadoes are possible. We urge everyone to seek shelter immediately. The bread nearly got stuck in Marcos's throat. He looked outside again and noticed the wind had changed. The trees no longer swayed gently. They were fighting against the heavy air that seemed to shove them in every direction. Max barked from the porch. "Easy, boy. It's just the wind." Still, something in the tone of the warning unsettled him. The radio now emitted a shrill emergency signal, followed by a more authoritative voice. Tornado confirmed 20 kilometers from Millfield. Category 5. Residents, take shelter immediately. Marcos dropped his mug into the sink. "Max, come here," he shouted, rushing to lock the windows. The dog bolted inside, and Marcos quickly headed down to the basement. It was a small space with concrete walls and an old shelf stocked with cans of beans. He crouched in the corner, holding Max close as the sound of the wind grew more terrifying. Above him, the house trembled. Marcos heard the sound of breaking glass and something heavy collapsing. "Hold on, boy. It'll pass. It'll pass." But it didn't seem like it would. The roar of the wind was like a relentless scream, and minutes felt like hours. Max was restless, panting and pressing against Marcos's legs. He tried to stay calm, but the sound of wood being torn apart made him clench his eyes shut. Finally, the noise began to subside. Slowly at first, then more quickly. Everything fell eerily silent. Marcos hesitated for a moment before getting up to open the basement door. When he stepped out, the sharp smell of splintered wood mixed with the humid air hit him. The sight was horrifying. Uprooted trees, fallen poles, and a chaos of debris scattered everywhere. His house had lost part of its roof, and the porch looked ready to collapse. "My God!" he murmured as Max nervously sniffed the ground. Walking cautiously toward the street, Marcos saw just how severe the situation was. The neighboring house was completely destroyed, reduced to a pile of wood and concrete. He saw no one around, only the occasional sound of things falling and the wind whispering through the wreckage. Then he heard it, a faint but distinct sound coming from his left. "Is someone there?" he shouted, looking around. The sound came again, a muffled cry. Marcos ran toward what used to be the elementary school. The structure was unrecognizable. The walls had crumbled, leaving exposed chunks of concrete and beams. "Help!" he yelled as he climbed over the debris. "If you can hear me, keep making noise." The crying became clearer, and he followed the sound. Finally, he saw movement. A small piece of blue fabric caught under a beam. "I'm here. I'll get you out," he said, unsure if the person could understand him. Marcos began pulling pieces of wood and concrete with his bare hands, ignoring the splinters slicing into his skin. He had to be quick. The sky was still dark, and there were signs the storm wasn't over. "You'll be okay. Just stay with me." After a few minutes of effort, he managed to lift the beam enough to pull out the small body beneath it. It was a little girl, no more than 8 years old. Her eyes were wide, her face covered in dust and tears. She clutched a notebook to her chest as if her life depended on it. "Are you hurt?" Marcos asked, kneeling beside her. She shook her head slightly but didn't say a word. "All right. Can you walk?" He tried to touch her arm, but she recoiled. "Hey, it's okay. I'm a friend, okay? I'll help you." The girl hesitated before reaching out her hand. Marcos carefully lifted her, holding her as if she were made of glass. "What's your name?" he asked as they walked back through the rubble. She didn't answer, only tightened her grip on the notebook. Marcos realized she was in shock. "That's okay. You don't have to talk right now. We'll get out of here." As they approached his house, Marcos glanced at the girl again. She was so small, so fragile, yet she seemed to carry the weight of the world at that moment. He tried to make small talk. "Were you at school? Was there anyone else with you? Parents? Siblings?" The girl finally looked at him, her large eyes brimming with tears, but still she said nothing. He decided not to press further. On the street, the few people who were there were crying and desperate. No one knew who the girl's parents were. They went back to Marcos's house, and when they arrived at the damaged porch, Max ran up to greet them, but Marcos held him back so he wouldn't scare the girl. "Don't worry about him. He's just a silly dog. He won't hurt you." She took a hesitant step back, but then relaxed when Max sat calmly beside Marcos. "Let's go inside. You're safe now." Inside the damaged but still livable house, thanks to the numerous reinforcements Marcos had made over time, he felt something different. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the girl that made him want to fight against the isolation he had chosen. As improbable as it seemed, he felt that she needed him just as much as he needed a reason to keep going. Marcos watched the girl as she sat on the floor, curled up like a wounded bird. The small notebook, now stained with dust, remained pressed against her chest. He didn't know what to do or say. It had been years since he'd had any meaningful interaction with anyone, let alone a child. Max cautiously approached, his tail wagging slowly, trying to appear friendly. The girl glanced at the dog, her eyes still fearful, but she didn't back away. "He's harmless. You can pet him if you want," Marcos suggested, his voice softer than he intended. She looked at him briefly, as if assessing whether she should trust him. She hesitated for a moment, but then reached out her thin hand to touch Max's head. The dog, satisfied, lay down beside her, wagging his tail more enthusiastically. "Good choice, kid," Marcos remarked, trying to ease the tension. "Max likes everyone. Me, not so much." The girl didn't react, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. Marcos headed to the kitchen, which had been minimally damaged by the wind, still trying to organize his thoughts. What would he do with her? Where were her parents? Had they survived the tornado? He opened the refrigerator, which had miraculously stayed in place, and took out a bottle of milk and a piece of bread. "Are you hungry?" he asked as he returned to the living room, holding the plate with trembling hands. She didn't reply, but her eyes followed the bread for a moment before looking away. "Look, I know this isn't much of a feast, but it's all I've got for now." He crouched down, placing the plate on the coffee table. "Eat a little, okay? You need to keep your strength up." The girl glanced at him again, then at the bread. Marcos stepped back, sitting in a worn-out armchair across the room. He watched her as she finally reached for the piece of bread, nibbling slowly. "Do you have a name?" he tried again, attempting to sound friendly. The girl stopped chewing and shook her head no, her eyes fixed on the notebook. "You don't want to talk? That's okay. I get it. Sometimes, not talking is easier." She remained silent, but her hand stroked the notebook more frequently, as if it were the only thing connecting her to the world. Marcos sighed and looked out the window. The street was unrecognizable, a maze of debris and fallen trees. He knew he needed to go out and look for help, but at the same time, he felt he couldn't leave her alone. "Listen," he began, looking at her again. "I don't know what happened to your family, but—" he hesitated, the words feeling too heavy to say. "I'll take care of you until we find them. You can trust me, okay?" The girl didn't respond, but she seemed to be listening. Max barked suddenly, and Marcos looked out the window to see two men walking down the street. They were carrying bags of something and appeared to be scavenging through the wreckage of the neighboring houses. "Looters," Marcos muttered, his jaw tightening. He turned back to the girl. "I need you to stay inside, okay? Don't open the door for anyone." She clutched the notebook tighter and nodded, her wide eyes full of fear. Marcos went to the door and locked it. He picked up a sturdy piece of wood he used in his workshop and positioned himself near the window. The men stopped on the sidewalk in front of the house, eyeing the damaged roof and the destroyed porch. "Hey, let's check this one out. Looks like no one's home," one of them said, his voice rough and casual. "Keep walking," Marcos muttered, gripping the piece of wood tightly. One of the men began climbing the porch steps, but before he could reach the door, Max started barking furiously. The man stepped back, raising his hands. Okay, someone's home. Let's go." The other man grumbled something, but the two moved on, disappearing among the debris. Marcos waited a few minutes before relaxing. He returned to the living room and found the girl hiding behind the couch, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay. They're gone," he said, crouching beside her. "Max is a pretty good bodyguard, huh?" She didn't respond, but he noticed a slight nod, almost imperceptible. "I know this is scary, but we're safe for now." He extended his hand to help her up, and this time she accepted. It was the first voluntary interaction she'd had with him, and Marcos felt a small wave of relief. As the day dragged on, he tried to keep her comfortable. He made weak tea and improvised a space on the couch with blankets. By early evening, as the sun disappeared on the horizon, he noticed she was dozing off, still clutching the notebook. He sat in the armchair, watching her. There was something deeply vulnerable about her, but also a quiet strength. Why didn't she speak? Was it the shock? Or something else? Marcos grabbed a blanket and carefully covered her, trying not to wake her. He sat back in the armchair and sighed. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't leave her alone. Max lay down beside the couch, as if he too had taken on the task of protecting her. The house was silent, except for the occasional sound of the wind outside. Marcos closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Memories of his own family flooded his mind, bringing back a pain he thought he had buried. He looked at the girl and murmured to himself, "I don't know who you are, but I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." Her notebook reflected a faint glow under the flashlight's beam, and for a moment he wondered what secrets it held. Secrets? Memories? He didn't know. Marcos woke to the sound of water dripping from the damaged roof of the house. The rain had started again during the night, turning the already stifling air into an oppressive, humid mix. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the previous day's events. The girl was sleeping deeply on the couch, with Max lying at her feet like a silent guardian. She still clutched the notebook to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Marcos couldn't sleep. Physical exhaustion was no match for the turmoil in his mind. That tornado hadn't just destroyed the village. It had unearthed memories Marcos had spent years trying to bury. He looked down at his hands, still dirty and scratched from the debris, and let out a heavy sigh. Max lifted his head, as if sensing the tension in the air. Marcos stretched his hand to pet him, but his back ached with the movement. The dog lay back down, but his eyes remained fixed on his owner. "This is just as hard for you as it is for me, huh, boy?" Marcos muttered, glancing at Max. He got up, trying not to make a sound, and stepped outside the cabin. The cold, damp night air wrapped around him, making him shiver. The rain had lessened, but the mud made the ground slippery. He sat on a fallen log, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the horizon cloaked in clouds. The solitude of the night brought back a familiar weight. The silence seemed to amplify the voices of the past that he tried so hard to ignore. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the image of Emily and Liam, but it came crashing back with force. "I should be with you now," he murmured, his voice breaking. It was the first time in a long while that he allowed the pain to surface. He clenched his fists as if he could crush the feeling. Instead, silent tears slid down his face. "You know what to do, Marcos. You always knew." He could almost hear Emily's voice. It was soft yet firm, just as she had been in life. He shook his head, trying to free himself from the memory, but something deep inside him knew he had to face it. He couldn't move forward while running away. "Why me?" he whispered, looking up at the dark sky. "Why was I the one who survived?" Inside the cabin, Sophia opened her eyes at the sound of the creaking door. Still half asleep, she noticed Marcos wasn't there. Clutching her notebook, she got up quietly and walked to the entrance. Outside, she found Marcos sitting on the log, his shoulders slumped, head bowed. He seemed to be talking to himself, but Sophia couldn't hear what he was saying. She stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. Marcos finally noticed her presence and lifted his head. The faint moonlight illuminated Sophia's curious eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to wipe away the traces of emotion still evident on his face. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice hoarse. Sophia took a few steps closer, clutching the notebook to her chest. She tilted her head slightly, as if asking, "Why?" He sighed, looking down at the ground. "Sometimes, the things you think you've buried come back, and when they do, they hurt." He smiled faintly, as if it were a private joke only he understood. Sophia sat down beside him, the notebook resting on her lap. She watched him with an attentiveness that seemed far beyond her years. "I had a family," he said after a long silence, his voice unsteady. "A wife, Emily, and a son, Liam." Sophia's eyes widened, surprised. It was the first time he had mentioned anything about his life. We were happy. Not perfect, but good." He stopped, shaking his head as if reliving a moment. "Emily was amazing, strong, determined, and Liam, well, he was just a little boy trying to grow up too fast." Marcos chuckled, but the sound quickly faded into a sigh. Sophia, still silent, slowly opened her notebook and began drawing. "One day. It all ended. It only took one night." He paused for a long time, gathering the strength to continue. "We were driving home from dinner. It was Emily's birthday. A truck ran the light. I didn't see it in time." His voice cracked, and he closed his eyes to hold back the tears. "Emily died instantly. Liam was in the hospital for a week. He looked down at his hands, as if still seeing the blood from that night. A whole week, and I couldn't save him. Since then, I isolated myself in this forgotten place. I never want to live in a big city again. Sophia stopped drawing but didn't look at him. Her small hands gripped the pencil tightly. "You know what's worse?" Marcos asked, staring at the sky. "I survived. And I never knew why." Sophia finished her drawing and turned the notebook toward him. The picture was simple yet full of meaning. A family of 3 holding hands under a tree. Above them, a small ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. Marcos froze, his gaze fixed on the drawing. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of pain and hope battling within him. It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you, Sophia." She pointed to the drawing and then to him, as if trying to say something. "Do you think it's still possible?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "That I can fix something?" Sophia gave him a small smile and nodded. Marcos laughed, surprised by the simplicity of her response. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he had almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, as the sun timidly peeked through the clouds, Marcos woke to Max licking his hand. Sophia was already awake, sitting beside the dog, drawing again. He watched her for a moment, feeling something shift inside him. "What are you drawing now?" he asked lightly. Sophia turned the notebook toward him. It was a simple but clear portrait, her and Marcos walking with Max along a tree-lined road. Marcos smiled, taking the notebook for a closer look. "You know, you're an incredible artist," he said, looking her in the eyes. "I think we have a chance to make this work." Sophia smiled again, this time a bit more openly. Marcos tucked the drawing into the side pocket of his backpack, where it would be safe. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of something greater than words could express. "All right, little artist. Let's get moving. We've got a long way to go." He stood and began packing their belongings. Sophia did the same, still holding the pencil she had used to draw. As they left the cabin and returned to the road, Marcos felt something different. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living, and somehow it was all because of Sophia. The sky, which once only threatened, now roared with thunder that seemed to tear through the silence of the devastated land. The rain returned with relentless fury, making the ground slick and treacherous. Marcos and Sophia trudged slowly along a deserted road, with Max trotting beside them. Every step was heavy, not just from accumulated exhaustion, but from the constant feeling that time was against them. "We need to find shelter before this storm gets worse," Marcos said, scanning the horizon where lightning illuminated the dense clouds. Sophia squeezed his hand, something she'd been doing more often in recent days. It was her silent way of communicating, showing that she trusted him even when the situation seemed hopeless. They continued until they spotted what looked like a bridge over a creek. As they approached, Marcos felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The bridge was in ruins. Part of the wooden structure had collapsed, leaving gaping holes, and the support cables swayed dangerously in the wind. "This isn't good," he murmured, glancing at Sophia. The girl looked back at him, waiting for an answer. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and expectation. "All right, here's the plan," Marcos said, crouching to her eye level. "We need to cross this bridge. There's no other option. But you're going to stay close to me the whole time, understand?" Sophia nodded slowly, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. "Good. I'll go first. Max, stay with her." He gestured to the dog, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Marcos tested the first few planks, which creaked under his weight but held firm. He took a deep breath and moved a few steps forward, keeping his eyes on the ground. The bridge swayed with the wind, and the sound of the violently rushing creek below only heightened his tension. "Come on!" "But slowly," he called back to Sophia. She started walking, hesitant, with Max by her side. Marcos extended his hand, and she gripped it tightly. "That's it. We're doing great," he said, trying to stay calm even though his heart was racing. They made it a few more meters before a loud clap of thunder froze Sophia in her tracks. "Hey, it's okay. Don't look down. Just look at me, all right?" Marcos said, squeezing her hand. She nodded and kept walking, but the wind picked up. The planks beneath their feet began to sway. When they were almost halfway across the bridge, one of the beams gave way with a loud crack, and Sophia screamed. "Hold on tight," Marcos shouted, pulling her close. The ground beneath them began to tilt, and Marcos knew they didn't have much time. "Sophia, listen to me." He knelt down, gripping her shoulders. "I'm going to carry you the rest of the way. Hold on to me, okay?" She hesitated but nodded, climbing onto his back. Marcos stood up slowly, feeling her small weight as he tried to maintain his balance. Max stayed close, growling softly at the wind that pushed them sideways. With each step, the bridge groaned louder. As they reached the last third of the crossing, one of the support cables snapped, and the entire structure swayed violently. "Damn it!" Marcos yelled, grabbing onto one of the planks. Sophia clung to him even tighter, her terrified screams piercing through the roar of the storm. Marcos looked toward the end of the bridge. They were so close, yet it seemed impossible to reach. "It's going to be okay. I promise." His voice sounded more confident than he felt. With one final push, he ran for the remaining stretch of the bridge. But just as they were about to reach safety, another beam gave way beneath his weight. He managed to toss Sophia forward onto solid ground, but he himself slipped, dangling from the edge. "Marcos!" Sophia screamed for the first time, her desperate voice cutting through the storm. He was startled to hear her say his name, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Stay there! Don't move!" he shouted as he struggled to pull himself up. Sophia, however, ignored his instructions. She crawled toward him, reaching out her small hand. "No, go back. It's dangerous," he yelled. But she didn't retreat. Using all the strength she could muster, she grabbed his arm while Max bit down on his jacket to help. With a final effort, Marcos managed to haul himself back onto the bridge. They ran together to the end, collapsing onto the ground once they finally reached solid land. The relief was short-lived. The wind intensified, and the rain now fell like a solid wall. They needed immediate shelter. That's when Marcos spotted a crumbling structure in the distance. It looked like an old house, almost entirely destroyed, but with a small hatch on the ground. "Quick, let's head there," he shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand. They ran toward the house, with Max close behind. Marcos pried open the hatch with difficulty, revealing a small, damp cellar. He pushed Sophia inside and followed, carrying Max in his arms. The cellar was cramped, filled with cobwebs, and smelled of mildew, but it was safe. Marcos collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. It was only then that he noticed the sharp pain in his side. Looking down, he saw blood seeping from a deep cut along his ribs. "Ah, damn it," he murmured, pressing his hand to the wound. Sophia's eyes widened with fear as she noticed the blood. "Hey, it's okay. I'll be fine." He tried to smile, but the pain made him grit his teeth. Without hesitation, Sophia opened her notebook and tore out several pages. She used them to press against the wound while rummaging through the backpack for anything that could help. She found the blanket and ripped it into strips to improvise a bandage. "You know what you're doing, huh?" Marcos said, trying to lighten the mood. Sophia didn't respond, but her movements were steady and determined. She pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound and tied it as tightly as she could. Okay. That's tight enough," he groaned, half laughing and wincing at the same time. Sophia gave him a small smile, though her eyes were filled with tears. "Hey, don't cry, okay? I've been through worse." He held her hand, trying to reassure her. Sophia leaned into him, burying her face in his chest as she hugged him. "It's okay, kid. I'm here." Marcos closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her embrace. For the first time, he realized just how strong she was, how mature for someone so young, and it only motivated him further to protect her, no matter the cost. As the storm raged on outside, they stayed huddled together in the small cellar, holding on to each other against the darkness. The sun timidly broke through the clouds, painting the sky in shades of grey and gold. It was the first glimpse of light Marcos and Sophia had seen in days. After hours of relentless rain, the storm had finally ceased, leaving a heavy silence in the air. But the world around them was unrecognizable. Uprooted trees, house debris, and mud blanketed the landscape, as if the earth had been rewritten by the forces of nature. Marcos was pale, the makeshift bandage on his right side stained with dried blood. Every step was an enormous effort, and he used a wooden stick as a crutch for support. Max walked close to him, alert to every sound, while Sophia clung to his hand, as though that alone was enough to keep him upright. They had spent the night in the cellar of a ruined house, sheltered from the worst of the storm. But the improvised refuge was temporary, and the urgency to reach the refugee camp grew with every passing hour. "We're close now," Marcos said, his voice weak but determined. Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. She didn't speak, but her gestures spoke volumes. She lightly touched his arm, as if asking, "Are you sure you can keep going?" Marcos answered with a faint smile. "Don't worry about me, little artist. I'm tougher than I look." They continued walking in silence, their footsteps accompanied only by the distant sound of birds cautiously returning to the devastated area. Max sniffed the ground, and Sophia scanned the surroundings, clutching her notebook tightly. After hours of trudging through the debris, they finally saw movement in the distance. Trucks, white tents, and a crowd of people formed what appeared to be the refugee camp. Sophia squeezed Marcos's hand, her face lit by a mix of relief and anxiety. "That's it. We made it," Marcos said, out of breath. He glanced at Sophia and attempted a joke. "I bet they have real food in there. Maybe even something that isn't stale bread." Sophia gave a faint smile, but her eyes remained cautious as she observed the camp. As they entered the site, a woman wearing an orange vest and a name badge approached them. She carried a tablet and looked exhausted, but maintained a professional demeanor. "Welcome. Are you injured? Do you need immediate medical attention?" she asked, quickly assessing them. "I think so." Marcos gestured to his side, where fresh blood had begun to seep through the bandage again. "All right, come with me." The woman signaled to a nearby volunteer. "Take him to the infirmary." Marcos looked at Sophia, who was clinging tightly to his hand. She shook her head frantically, as if to say, "Don't leave me." "It's okay, calm down," Marcos said, kneeling down with difficulty to meet her eye level. "You're coming with me, all right? I promise I won't go anywhere without you." She hesitated for a moment, but finally loosened her grip enough for the volunteers to guide them to a large white tent. Inside the infirmary, Marcos was placed on a cot while Sophia sat nearby, watching every move the doctors made. A grey-haired man examined the wound and sighed. "You're lucky. The cut is deep, but it didn't hit any vital organs. I'll need to stitch it now." "Do what you need to do," Marcos replied, gritting his teeth as the doctor prepared the instruments. Sophia moved closer, holding his hand tightly as the doctor began stitching the wound. Marcos groaned quietly but tried to mask the pain, glancing at her. "Hey, I'm fine. You don't need to look so worried." He forced a smile. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. "You're braver than me, you know that? Bet you wouldn't make such a fuss over this." The doctor interjected. "She's been taking care of you, hasn't she? Looks like you've got a little personal nurse here." "She's a lot more than that." Marcos looked at Sophia and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I don't know what I would have done without her." After the wound was treated, Marcos was moved to a smaller tent where he could rest. But before he had a chance to relax, a volunteer approached with a clipboard. "We're working on reuniting separated families. Do you have anyone you'd like us to locate?" Marcos looked at Sophia, who sat silently beside him. She stayed still, her eyes wide as she processed the question. "She lost her parents in the tornado. I don't know their names, but I can describe how she looked when I found her," Marcos offered. The volunteer quickly jotted down the information and said, "We'll look into it. It may take a few hours, but we'll do our best." Sophia looked at Marcos, and he saw something unexpected. Fear. Not the fear of not finding her parents, but the fear of losing him. "Hey, it's all right," he said, leaning forward despite the pain in his side. "This is good news. If we find your parents, you can be with them again. That's what you want, right?" She didn't respond. Instead, she lowered her head and clutched her notebook tightly. The hours passed slowly. Marcos tried to rest, but his thoughts were conflicted. He wanted Sophia to find her family, but he knew that would mean losing her. It was selfish to admit, but the thought of her leaving unsettled him. Finally, the same volunteer returned, holding a piece of paper. "We have good news. We found a couple matching the description of her parents. They're in another section of the camp." Marcos glanced at Sophia, who now seemed even more nervous. "That's incredible," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic, though his voice wavered. "Let's go meet them." Sophia hesitated but walked beside them as they made their way through the camp. When they reached the designated area, a man and a woman stood nearby, looking around anxiously. Sophia froze, her eyes fixed on the couple. She didn't move. "Go ahead," Marcos said, gently encouraging her with a light push. She took a hesitant step, then another. The woman finally saw her and began running toward her, tears streaming down her face. "Sophia!" she cried, dropping to her knees and embracing the girl tightly. The girl's father joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. Sophia stayed motionless for a moment, in shock, before collapsing into tears in her parents' arms. Marcos stood a few feet away, watching the scene from a distance. His heart was filled with conflicting emotions, joy for Sophia and a subtle pain at the imminent separation. After a few minutes, Sophia turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. She ran back and hugged him tightly, as if she didn't want to let go. "Hey, little artist, this is a good thing," he said, running a hand through her hair. "You're with your family now." She shook her head, signaling that she didn't want to be apart. "No matter where I am, I'll always be rooting for you." He swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. "Now go on. They need you." Sophia finally pulled away, but her eyes never left his as she returned to her parents' arms. As he walked back to his tent, Marcos felt something shift inside him. He had lost someone important, but for the first time, he felt he had done something right. Something that truly mattered. The next morning began with a clear sky for the first time in days. Sunlight illuminated the refugee camp, but the surrounding landscape remained grim, with white tents forming a temporary oasis amid the devastation. Marcos sat on an improvised bench near his tent, still recovering after treatment in the infirmary. Max lay at his feet, watching attentively, while Marcos absent-mindedly petted his ears. His thoughts lingered on the farewell from the night before. He tried to ignore the pang of emptiness he felt since Sophia had returned to her parents' arms. It was what he had always wanted for her, but that didn't make the separation any easier. "Marcos," a soft female voice called out. He looked up and saw Sophia's mother, a woman with light brown hair and deep, expressive eyes, approaching with Sophia by her side. Her father followed closely behind, his face etched with gratitude. "Can we talk to you?" she asked, stopping a few steps away. Marcos stood, despite the lingering pain in his side. "Of course. Is something wrong?" The mother quickly shook her head, appearing emotional. "No, nothing wrong. It's just, we need to thank you. Last night, we were so overwhelmed, and by the time we looked for you, you were already gone." The father stepped forward and extended his hand to Marcos. "We don't have the words to express how grateful we are. You saved our daughter." Marcos shook his hand, surprised by the firm sincerity of the gesture. "I didn't do anything anyone else wouldn't have done. She's an incredible kid." Sophia looked at him, clutching her notebook as she always did. She seemed hesitant, her gaze fixed on Marcos, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "When the tornado hit, we were at home, miles away from her school," the mother explained, her voice trembling. "That day was chaos. We couldn't get to her. The roads were destroyed, and she paused, looking down. "I passed out when the storm cleared. I was brought to this shelter without even knowing if she was alive. We spent all this time praying someone would find her," the father added, pointing to an injury on his foot. "I wasn't allowed to search for her because of my condition. Then we heard about her last night. Knowing you took care of her. We don't know how to thank you." Marcos shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "She helped me more than I helped her." The mother glanced at Sophia, who stood silently, clutching her notebook as though it held all the secrets of the world. "She told us a few things. About how you protected her. About your journey together." Marcos looked away, fidgeting with his fingers, uncomfortable with the attention. "It was hard, but she was amazing. Stronger than any child should have to be." Suddenly, Sophia stepped forward and took Marcos's hand. He looked down at her, surprised, as she opened her notebook and showed him a new drawing. It was him, building something, with Sophia by his side holding tools. In the background, there was a house and children playing near a school. Marcos stared at her, unsure of what to say. "Is this what you want?" he asked softly. Sophia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "She hasn't stopped talking about you since she came back to us," her father said with a smile. "We thought she was exaggerating, but now we understand. You're important to her, Marcos," her mother added, "and I think she's important to you too." Marcos hesitated, looking at the drawing again. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "Yes, you are," Sophia said, her small voice firm. Marcos fell silent, surprised. Something stirred inside him, a feeling he had long avoided, a sense of belonging. The following days brought an unexpected transformation. Although reluctant at first, Marcos eventually accepted the family's invitation to stay in the small village near the shelter, helping to rebuild the community. With the roads reopened, travel became easier. Sophia's school, one of the region's cornerstones, had been completely destroyed by the tornado. The residents were trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage, but needed guidance. That's when Marcos realized he could do more than just watch. He could lead. We need to start with the foundation. If we rebuild this right, the structure will withstand any storm, he explained to a group of residents, sketching a plan in the dirt with a stick. How do we do that? We don't have enough resources, an older man asked, frowning. Marcos looked around, assessing what they had. We can use what's already here. The leftover wood, the metal beams that are still intact. Then we'll get the rest piece by piece. I heard funding is coming from the capital. The group seemed skeptical at first, but slowly they began to see progress. Within days, Marcos organized teams to collect reusable materials, while other volunteers from the refugee camp brought tools and supplies. Donations of materials, food, and money began arriving from various places. Sophia was always by his side, watching intently as he worked. She rarely spoke but constantly drew, filling her notebook with images of the school being rebuilt, houses rising from the ruins, and residents smiling. You like watching things come together, huh? Marcos said, glancing at one of her drawings. She smiled and nodded. The community gradually began to reorganize. People who had once been lost in the chaos now had something to believe in, and Marcos, without realizing it, had become a central figure in that effort. Do you have a knack for this, you know? Sophia's father said one day while helping to raise a wall. For what? Marcos asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. For leading. These people need someone like you. Marcos chuckled, shaking his head. I'm not a leader. I'm just trying to help. Maybe that's exactly what makes you a leader. Marcos remained silent, but the words stayed with him. When the first classroom of the school was completed, the community held a small celebration. Residents gathered to thank everyone who had helped, and Sophia handed Marcos a drawing. It depicted him smiling, surrounded by the children at the school. In the corner, Sophia had drawn herself holding his hand. Are you trying to tell me something, little artist? He asked, holding the paper carefully. Sophia smiled and nodded, as if to say, You already know. Marcos looked around at the people who now relied on him, at the children playing among the construction beams, and at Sophia, who looked up at him as if he were invincible. For the first time, he felt he had found a purpose. I think you're right, he said, smiling. In that moment, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden light over what had once been a landscape of destruction. Now, signs of rebuilding shone everywhere. The small school that had been destroyed by the tornado was almost ready. Children ran around the new structure, their laughter echoing like music to everyone's ears. Marcos stood near the main yard, adjusting the position of a wooden plank that would serve as an improvised bench. He wiped the sweat from his brow and smiled as Max wagged his tail by his side. The dog seemed as content as Marcos with the progress. Around him, the community had gathered for a rare moment of celebration. Stalls with simple food, makeshift tables, and small flower arrangements gave the place a festive air. There was a collective sense of relief that, even after the worst disasters, life could find a way to continue. It's not perfect, but it's starting to feel like a real place again, don't you think? Sophia's father said, walking up to him with a smile. Marcos chuckled softly. Perfect has never been my specialty, but it's good to see it all coming together. Sophia's father patted him on the shoulder. You've done so much for everyone here, more than anyone could have expected. Marcos shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what needed to be done. Sophia's father smiled, recognizing Marcos's genuine modesty. Maybe, but that doesn't mean we won't remember it. As the celebration continued, Marcos watched Sophia from a distance. She was near one of the tables, drawing in her inseparable notebook. Her mother stood beside her, helping arrange plates while chatting animatedly with other women in the community. Sophia's face was serene but focused, as it always was when she was creating something on paper. "Are you going to rest a little, or are you going to keep pretending you're a machine?" Sophia's mother teased, approaching him with a plate of food. Marcos smiled. "I think I could eat something." She handed him the plate and sat next to him on a bench. "You know, Marcos, I don't think we'll ever be able to thank you enough for everything you've done for Sophia, and for all of us. There's no need to thank me. She saved my life as much as I saved hers." Sophia's mother looked at him with eyes full of understanding. "Maybe she was the strength you needed, but you were the safe harbor she was searching for." Marcos looked away, feeling the familiar pang of emotion he tried to avoid. The afternoon wore on, and the celebration continued. Children played with makeshift balls while adults laughed and shared stories. Marcos was in the middle of a conversation with some residents when Sophia timidly approached, holding her notebook. "Hey, little artist," he called out, smiling as he saw her. "What did you come up with now?" She looked him in the eye and held out the notebook. The open page revealed a new drawing, carefully and meticulously detailed. It was a scene of them together. Marcos, Sophia, and her parents stood side by side, working on a house being rebuilt. In the background, the school stood proudly, with children playing in the yard. "Is that us?" he asked, touching the paper gently. Sophia nodded, smiling with a sparkle in her eyes. "It's perfect," he said, his voice filled with emotion. He glanced at Sophia's parents, who were standing nearby, and added, "I don't think I've ever felt part of something like this before." Sophia's mother smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're part of our family now, Marcos." "I never had any doubt about that," her father said, extending his hand to him once more. Marcos held the notebook for a long moment before looking back at Sophia. "Thank you for this, little artist. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She gave a small smile and leaned in to hug him. It was a simple gesture, but Marcos felt it carried everything she couldn't express in words. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Marcos walked to a nearby hill where he could see the community and the school in the background. Max followed him, lying down beside him as he gazed at the horizon. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the man he was before the tornado, lost and isolated, and the man he had become since then. "Would you call this a new beginning, Max?" he asked, petting the dog. Max wagged his tail, as if silently agreeing. Marcos smiled, feeling a comforting warmth in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He had a family, a purpose, and a place where he belonged. He looked out at the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear, and felt a quiet certainty that, no matter what the future held, he was ready to face it.